Nobody in that theater that night was thinking about Marvin Gaye. That is the plain truth of it. November 1962, somewhere in the American South, and the Motown Review was moving through these cities like a traveling church. Packed buses, second-hand hotel rooms, and an itinerary that left no room for anything other than the work. The crowds filling those seats had one name on their minds, and it belonged to Smokey Robinson. They wanted the miracles. They wanted those harmonies they'd been pulling out of their radios all year, the ones that felt less like songs and more like somebody had figured out how to put human longing on tape and sell it for 99 cents. The young man standing in the hallway backstage was not part of that equation. He was 23 years old. Stubborn Kind of Fellow had come out that September, and it had moved numbers at a handful of R&B stations. Enough for Berry Gordy to put him on the tour, but not enough for his name to mean anything to the people walking through those doors. The printed program listed him third from the bottom. He had been given 40 minutes. Raymond Cole found him 45 minutes before showtime. Cole was the tour's production manager, a Detroit man who had been running road shows since before Marvin could shave. He was lean, precise, and completely without sentimentality about what the job required. 40 minutes, he said. The crew needs the stage cleared and reset before Smokey's lighting rig goes up. He didn't say it unkindly. He just said it like a man reading from a manifest. Marvin nodded, said thank you, and when Cole turned and walked back toward the loading dock, Marvin stood alone in that hallway and looked at the wall for a long moment. He'd been carrying something for months, not stage fright. He'd been performing since he was a teenager, singing in his father's church in Washington before he understood what a stage was. This was something different, something that sat heavier than nerves and had been building since spring, since the conversations at Hitsville that kept circling back to the same instructions. Berry Gordy had been clear with him. You have something, Gordy would say, but you're pointing it in the wrong direction. The rawness, the gospel thickness in his voice, the way emotion worked its way into his runs and pushed them somewhere uncontrolled. That was a problem. The market didn't want untidy. They wanted polish. They wanted a black voice that could cross over to white radio without making program directors uncomfortable. Think about Nat Cole. Someone on Gordy's staff had told him that summer. Clean, restrained, the kind of delivery that fits inside a tuxedo. Marvin had tried. He'd stood in the studio on West Grand Boulevard and pulled his voice back the way they asked, shaped it into something with the edges filed down. And every single time he did it, he could hear something leave. Some quality that lived in the space between control and the thing that existed before control. The part that came directly from Sunday mornings in his father's church, which brought him to the other voice. His father had not wanted him on the stage, had not wanted him on any stage. Marvin Gaye Sr. preached that the music of the world was a snare. The church gave you your voice for one purpose, and that purpose was not to make people dance in a theater in Georgia or Alabama or wherever they were tonight. Using it otherwise wasn't ambition. It was ingratitude dressed up as talent. Marvin stood in that hallway with both voices sitting right beside him. Gordy's voice telling him to shrink, his father's voice telling him to stop. And underneath both of them, a third thing, quieter and older than either, that had no instructions attached. Just a sound, just the thing itself, waiting. The theater was maybe 2/3 full when the house lights dropped part way and the band kicked into the intro. People were still finding seats. Conversations were running. The energy in the room was the specific warm energy of an audience that had arrived somewhere they'd been looking forward to. Not for this, but for the act that would follow. Raymond Cole stood at the side of the stage with his arms folded and his clipboard under his elbow. Opening acts were a logistical reality. You kept them on time, you kept them from complicating the headline, and as long as those things held, the night ran correctly. He looked at his watch. Then he looked at the stage. The band finished the intro. Marvin stepped to the microphone. What happened in the next 8 bars, Raymond Cole would not have immediate language for. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with any kind of theatrical intent. Marvin just stood at that microphone and opened his mouth. And what came out of him was not the managed, careful version the sessions on West Grand Boulevard had been trying to construct. It was something that had been living behind all those corrections, waiting with a patience that was almost frightening. And now it was out, plainly and without apology, filling that theater the way heat fills a closed room. Not all at once, but thoroughly, until there is no part of the air it hasn't reached. The conversations near the back didn't stop all at once. They stopped the way leaves stop moving when the wind dies. One at a time, then completely, then as if they had never been moving. A woman in the fourth row let a sentence trail off without finishing it. A man somewhere in the middle folded his program and put it in his lap without deciding to. Earl Briggs noticed it before most people. Briggs was Smokey Robinson's musical director, a serious, economical man who had been playing keys behind serious singers since the mid-1950s. He had been standing stage left reviewing the set list when the sound from the stage made him look up. He stood there a moment, processing. Then he took 3 steps left so he could see the stage clearly. He did not go back to the set list. Marvin was building, not performing a build, not the calculated escalation of a showman working toward a planned peak. This was something less constructed and more inevitable. There was grief in it. There was argument. The sound of a man settling something out loud that had been unsettled for a very long time. The gospel training was right there on the surface. Everything Gordy's team had been asking him to contain, given freely now to 2,000 strangers who had come for a different show. He let go of the microphone stand somewhere in the third song, took a small step back, looked at the band with an expression every musician in that room understood without being told. They dropped back, instrument by instrument, until the theater was holding almost nothing. Just that voice, the space around it, and the attention of everyone in the building pointed in the same direction. A moment arrived where everything stopped pretending, not stopped performing, stopped in the way a room stops when something true has entered it without asking permission. The kind of stop that only happens when the person on stage has let go of performing entirely and is simply, without armor, there. Marvin climbed to the note, held it past the point where safety would have said to release it, let it expand into the dark above the balcony, and then let it go. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the silence of a room holding its breath as one body. A full, motionless second where nobody moved and nobody spoke, and the air needed a beat before it could continue. Then the theater came down, not courtesy applause, not the warm acknowledgement you extend to an opening act for showing up. This was something with genuine weight behind it, with urgency. People making noise because staying quiet had become physically impossible. It came from the back of the room and the front at the same time, and it was loud and it was real, and it was considerably more than anything on Raymond Cole's clipboard had budgeted for. Cole was standing very still at the side of the stage. He had not checked the time in a long while. He was not certain when he had stopped. Earl Briggs had not moved from where he'd stopped to watch. The set list was still in his hand. He had not opened it again. Smokey Robinson walked out to that audience 30 minutes later, immaculate, prepared, fully in command. He did what he always did, and the crowd gave him what they had come to give. They loved him. They sang along. They responded the way a well-worked audience responds to a master. But Smokey felt the room. An artist at that level always feels the room. In a room that has already been somewhere is a particular thing to step into. The texture of the attention is different. The applause has a different weight. The audience is warm and generous, but something in them has already traveled somewhere unexpected and hasn't entirely returned. Smokey was too professional to let it show. He played his set and he played it beautifully, but he felt it. The tour continued south and turned back north as November moved toward December. Marvin finished his 40 minutes every night, cleared the stage on time, let the headline act take over. He showed up. He didn't give Raymond Cole headaches. He did his job with the professionalism of someone who understood that being allowed to do it at all was not guaranteed. But something had shifted quietly in how the crew watched from the wings, in the way certain audience members began arriving a few minutes earlier on nights they'd heard something, in the still, attentive quality of Earl Briggs standing stage left, night after night, no longer looking at his set list. Stubborn Kind of Fellow climbed the R&B chart that November. It didn't explode into the mainstream the way the later records would. Not yet. But it moved with a momentum that felt different from what had come before. like something that had found its own weight and stopped asking permission to take up space. Marvin Gaye would go on to make music that stopped people wherever they were, records that asked questions Berry Gordy hadn't approved and that radio programmers hadn't pre-cleared. He would fight for that music at costs that nobody standing in that hallway in November 1962 could have calculated. He would refuse again and again to sand himself into something easier to sell. All of it started somewhere. Raymond Cole asked years later about that night on the Motown Review, described it without elaboration. He said he remembered going still at the side of the stage and staying that way. He said he remembered understanding, not as a thought, but as something that landed before thinking could start, that what he was watching was not going to stay contained in 40 minutes in a third from the bottom billing. He said he couldn't tell you when he stopped checking his watch, only that by the time the noise came down, it had stopped mattering. That is the particular thing about a voice that has made its decision. It doesn't petition the room for permission. It doesn't wait to see whether the crowd has marked the calendar. It opens and the room adjusts because the room has no other option. What Marvin Gaye did on that stage in November 1962 was not complicated. He walked out in front of a crowd that had come for someone else, carrying everything he'd been told to leave in the hallway, and he gave it to them without apology and without restraint. Some nights in the years ahead would cost him for that. Some rooms would not be ready. But that night in that theater, the truest version of what he carried was enough. More than enough. Have you ever walked into a room that wasn't ready for you and gave them everything anyway? Tell us in the comments.